In the late 1800s and early 1900s, the suffrage movement was growing and many women fought together for the right to vote. White women and women of color. Eventually, in 1919, white women did earn the right to vote, while women of color did not, even though they would never have achieved this goal without them.
On June 4, 1919, the 19th Amendment was passed. This amendment gave women the right to vote. But not all women.
Women of color fought alongside white women for their equal rights, pushing for equality and more rights for women.
The amendment stated the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. But, because of other constitutions and laws against people of color, many women were prohibited from utilizing the right they significantly made happen.
These women constantly faced racial prejudice along with sexism for being a woman with opinions in the 19th and 20th centuries. Among many other powerful women, Mabel Pinkwali, Sitkala Shaw, and Ida B. Wells Barnett were suffragists who stood up to hate based on race and gender.
In the time of the Civil Rights Movement, when America was changing greatly, there were many conventions and events based where abolitionists gathered to fight to end slavery. Among these abolitionists were Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony.
Within the protests and conventions against slavery, there were women and some men who spun and enlarged into the idea to fight for women's rights.
Some women became more focused on the women's rights cause and separated from the abolitionist movement. These women split off and faced much hate for organizing events and ideas together, as it wasn't what women were known to do.
The first Women's Rights Convention was held on the 19th and 20th of July in 1848 in Seneca Falls, New York. At the convention, there were over 200 women in attendance who discussed topics of religion, social, and civil rights, as well as 11 rights that over time were eventually passed after hard persuasion and work.
Through the years, the movement gathered more and more supporters, reaching other cities and people who either joined the movement or were strongly against it.
Some women argued that they didn't need the right to vote and that their husbands would take care of that matter. They were happy and satisfied with the way their lives were and had no need for the new rights.
Some who were opposed to women's suffrage established anti-suffrage organizations like the National Association Opposed to Women's Suffrage and newsletters like the Women's Protest or the Anti-Suffragist. These people believed that allowing women to seek enfranchisement was against the laws of nature, but many women still stuck to their idea that women were just as good as men and were able to push through the hate.
During the Civil War, there became a divide between people who wanted to pause the suffrage movement to focus on the war and those who wanted to take the war as a chance to enforce the movement further.
Once the war ceased and slavery was abolished in the U.S., African American men soon gained the right to vote after the passing of the 15th Amendment, which stated, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude."
This enraged many of the white women suffragists. They were upset that black men were allowed to vote when they were not and found this unfair.
There was a divide after this between the white suffragists who believed they were better than people of color and those who weren't white.
Debates on who deserved the right to vote more than the other. Most men were against the women's suffrage movement as they thought women were only fit to take care of homes and children, not sharing their opinions on political issues. Some women even fought against each other because they agreed with men that women were not to concern themselves with these issues. While many women believed that they should have the right to suffrage, women were faced with prejudice for their race, and this caused a divide amongst suffragists.
Despite being discriminated against because of race and gender, women of color fought hard for their deserved right to vote, the right that all people should be able to have.
These debates took a lot of hard work and dedication. The women who fought were strong and powerful. When the 19th Amendment was passed, all the hard work paid off, but not for all of those who made such a contribution.
Laws like the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 and Jim Crow laws, even with the amendment giving all women the right to vote, many could still not vote despite them making just as many contributions and certainly deserving it.
Mabel Pinkwali was a strong advocate for women's suffrage. She was born on October 7, 1897 in Canton City, China. When she was 4 years old, she moved to New York City in 1905. From a very young age, Mabel became involved in fighting for women's rights.
16 years of age, on May 4, 1912, in New York City, she led a suffrage parade on horseback. Later, she attended Barnard College and majored in history and philosophy. She became the first Chinese woman to graduate with a PhD in economics.
Mabel wrote feminist essays for the Chinese Students Monthly and spoke about the importance of women's rights and equalities. She also gave a speech at the Women's Political Union Suffrage Shop, where she was able to talk about education for Chinese women.
Sitkala Shaw, also known by her missionary name Gertrude Simmons Bonham, formed and contributed to many different associations that promoted women's rights. She was born on February 22, 1876, in the Yankton Indian Reservation in South Dakota.
She attended Earlham College in Richmond, Indiana. After college, she worked with the Society of American Indians and wrote about how Native Americans lived.
Throughout her life, she took part in and founded many organizations, including the National Council of American Indians. This organization worked to unite Native American tribes around the U.S. and help them gain the right to vote.
While helping with women's suffrage, Gertrude faced poverty when she was young and struggled to keep her culture alive. She also suffered from inequality for being an American Indian. Despite her challenges, she was still a strong advocate for women's suffrage and fought hard for women's deserved rights.
Ida Wells Barnett was another suffragist who dedicated her life to helping women gain the right to vote. She was born into slavery on July 16, 1862, in Holly Springs, Mississippi. In 1884, her family moved to Memphis, Tennessee.
She attended West College and later became a teacher. As well as a teacher, Ida was also an activist, journalist, and researcher. She was a member of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, who organized suffrage parades like the one that took place in Washington, D.C. in 1913.
Ida fought for rights for black women as she was a victim of being discriminated against her because of her race. Motivated to help all women gain the right to vote, she participated in many civil rights organizations. She was the founder of the National Association of Colored Women's Club, which highlighted suffrage issues and civil rights.
Ida overcame many hardships to accomplish what she had done, but sadly died on March 25, 1931.
Of the women suffragists fighting for equal rights and the right to vote, at least 1/16 of the women were not white. This seems like a small number, but of the about 50,000 women in the organization, that's over 3,000 women who fought and were not granted the right to vote.
In a movement as important and grand as the suffrage movement, every single person fighting for it matters greatly. These women gave up so much, including their respect in their communities, to fight for what they believed in, and for the group of women who were not granted equal rights simply because of their skin color. This was unfair.
At a point in the suffrage movement, white suffragists used racist tactics to gain the vote of others. As of the 15th Amendment, African American men were given the right to vote, which not all white Americans liked. The women used this advancement to tell men upset about African Americans being allowed to vote that if white voters were given the ability to vote, they would outbalance the African American voters and the white supremacy would be restored.
This tactic was clearly wrong, but it did persuade a certain group of men. The amendment that gave women the right to vote was approved in 1919 and ratified in 1920, where all those white women were allowed to vote and outweigh the deemed wrong black votes.
Women of color and other suffragists fought at campaigns and used their voice to speak about their opinions, and stressed the importance of not only women's suffrage but also women's rights in general. These campaigns gave women of color a chance to fight for themselves and become strong leaders. These taught women how to be prominent and firmly stand up for what they believed.
These women were all unfairly treated because of their sex and race, but they were strong fighters and stood up to the white men and women who looked down on them. Many debates took place, some were won, some were lost, but because of women like Mabel Pinckney Lee, Gertrude Simmons Bonham, and Ida Wells Barnett, who were dedicated and perseverant to the cause, women of color eventually gained the right to vote at different times before the end of the 20th century.
1919, when the 19th Amendment was passed and women gained the right to vote, women of color were unfairly denied this right. However, without the help and contributions of women of color, white women would have never gained this right in the first place. Despite being ridiculed and denied the natural human right to vote, women of color still fought for their rights. These women were devoted to gaining equal rights with men. They believed very strongly in this cause. As Mabel Pinckney Lee has said, feminism is nothing more than the extension of democracy or social justice and equality of opportunities to women. This stresses the importance of women and the rights that they deserve. Today, all women are able to vote without being denied because of their race or gender as a result of the hard work and dedication women of color gave to this cause.